Well, good evening, and thank you all very much indeed for coming along to our event this evening. Generation Mobile is the UK behind the curve, kindly sponsored by Three. As I think you can probably tell, I am not Charles Arthur. He is on his way but is meeting a deadline, so we may seamlessly swap during the course of the event. But I'm from the Evans from Policy Exchange, and once again I'd like to welcome you here this evening. Consumers are increasingly using mobile devices such as the iPhone, the iPad, and, if you can believe it, products not made by Apple. So how as a country can we make the most of the new technology, and perhaps importantly, what is the role of government in this? We've got an expert panel to discuss some of the issues this evening before we open up to a question and answer and discussion. We've got Mark Alera, Marketing Director of Three, Sarah Hunter, Head of UK Public Policy from Google, John Whittingdale, Chairman of the Commons Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, and Steve Unger, Group Head of Strategy, Chief Economist and Technology Group at Ofcom. Each of our panellists are going to say a few words, and as I say, we'll then open up to questions and discussion. So I'm first going to hand over to Mark.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. If anyone was in any doubt as to how the internet has gone mobile, for me just watching every single one of you whilst you've been waiting for this event to start on your smartphones, maybe even on your iPads, accessing the internet. You know, the internet truly has gone mobile, and for many UK consumers, mobile is now the only access point through which they use the internet. So for 1 in 5 smartphone users, that is the only way that those consumers actually access the internet. Fixed line for them is something that they don't even need, don't even want. There are some consumers out there for whom fixed line is something they cannot afford also, so they may be in rented accommodation or in very tough economic circumstances where pay-as-you-go mobile broadband or mobile internet is the only way that those consumers can actually get access to the internet. So mobile's really taken off in a very big way for a number of different reasons. And it's not just my view. There are a number of people and very respected analysts and consumer groups out there that believe by the end of this Parliament, this is the time frame we're talking about now. I'm not talking about a 10, 20-year horizon. I'm talking the next 2 to 3 years, that mobile will become the dominant access point for consumers to get onto the internet. So that's all going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years. And from a mobile operator's point of view, what does that mean? Well, you know, we are in the business of providing consumers to access the internet through our networks. And what we've seen, and all of the mobile operators have seen in the UK over the last 2 to 3 years, is what can only be described as an explosion of usage of data. There's been over 2,000% increase in just a couple of years of data usage on mobile networks. The graph that I show here is the growth in data on the Three network in the last 2 to 3 years. So you can see the point where mobile broadband, mobile internet and smartphones all started to grow in terms of adoption. Very, very steep curve there, and in fact 97% of the traffic that we carry across our mobile network is now data. 97%. And just to pick a couple of services as well, just to give you some context as to what consumers are doing on our network, I've picked a couple. One is Skype. I make no apology for promoting the fact that we are still the only UK operator that actually allows our customers to use Skype without penalty, without trying to block that service. So we want as many of our customers as possible to make free calls over the internet using a fantastic service. And in just a couple of years, we've grown from 33 million minutes per month of Skype traffic to over 100 million. So effectively 1 billion minutes per year of voice over IP traffic, internet traffic carried across a mobile operator's network. Many of you would have seen the recent film talking about the social network, the film. This is the impact of Facebook growth on our network. So number of page views, so customers accessing a Facebook page, go back 2 years, we've got a figure there of 67 million, which sounds like a lot, until you look at December, so effectively last month, over 1 billion page views, so from 33 million to 1 billion in 2 years. So what we're seeing is more and more customers are accessing the internet, and those that are accessing the internet are doing more and more stuff at an exponential rate. So it's really taken off in a very good way. So for us, what that's meant is we've effectively had to grow our network, both in terms of coverage and capacity, to handle all of this extra data traffic. And what we've been very busy with over the last few years at 3 is doubling the size of our network, investing hundreds of millions of pounds to improve coverage for customers that already have coverage but want to access the internet and do more and more things, and also bringing new coverage to many places which either didn't have coverage for mobile, but there are, as many of you are aware, some places in the country that don't actually have access to fixed broadband. So for many people, mobile is a solution for providing internet access where they don't have fixed coverage. And I've got a couple of examples here, and I will get the spelling wrong on this one. This is a place in Wales called Glenpluith, and this is a place that a couple of years ago did not have fixed mobile, fixed broadband, and our network rollout, which, as I've just explained, has been doubling up and down the country, has brought the residents of this town access to the internet, something they haven't had before. So they were effectively excluded from the digital economy with the wonderful things that the internet brings us. And here's another example, Bridlington in Humberside. This is an area that has a disproportionate amount of low-income people, a disproportionate amount of elderly people as well. For many of those people living in Bridlington, mobile is the only choice for them. Mobile broadband is the only choice for them to access the internet. And on top of that, the fixed broadband coverage in that area is both poor and expensive. So again, we are the only solution for that town. And indeed, we see a disproportionate amount of traffic on our mobile broadband network coming from towns such as Bridlington. And I'm probably going to make 2 very obvious statements over the next couple of slides. The first is that competition is a good thing. And competition is a good thing in mobile because it drives innovation and rollout and improved coverage for consumers. And I'll also talk about the impact on price. So not very surprising statements to make, but if you look at the mobile market, pre-2000, we are a new entrant, and shapely and new entrant in this marketplace. There were 4 players. There was around 80% population coverage. Then we came along and increased the competition in the marketplace. Another player coming in, and I'll show you in a minute the impact that we've had on price, but also on coverage. Our coverage now is at 97%, and that is way in excess of our licence commitments. So we've been bringing more and more coverage to places that haven't had coverage before for mobile internet. And unsurprisingly, a new entrant brings down prices. It's our role to acquire and bring more and more customers to our network. We believe one of the ways we can do that is give them better value. And what I'm showing here is going back to 2007, the price for mobile broadband. So about 3 years ago, for a gigabyte of data, consumers were paying £50. £50 for a gigabyte of data. We came into the mobile broadband market and charged £10 for a gigabyte of data. In 2007, the mobile broadband market was a million consumers. It was a niche service. It was a very expensive service for people in the city, and people in the city effectively whose companies were paying the bills. It was not a mass market consumer service. Fast forward 3 years, it's a 5 million market, and everyone is charging in and around £10 for a gigabyte. So this is a very good illustration, I think, of the impact of competition on price. So I'm going to talk a little bit about spectrum, which is something some of you know a lot about, some of you know very little about. The best articulation, the best explanation I can give of spectrum is effectively the airwaves that none of us can see or touch, that carries all of this data traffic, all of the internet traffic. And because we have seen such an explosion in customers using internet and the amount that they're using, if we carry on as we are with the current spectrum, none of the mobile networks will be able to cope with this volume of traffic. So there has to be more spectrum made available to mobile operators to carry this continued growth in mobile data. And there are differences in the types of spectrum that can be provided. Some of it is what we call low frequency and some of it is high frequency. All you need to know really is low frequency helps consumers, or helps mobile operators rather, access rural areas 5 times more cheaply than it does for those for higher frequency spectrum. And higher frequency spectrum helps us penetrate buildings in urban areas or cities to give customers better and faster internet access in areas that are getting quite congested, towns and cities, urban areas. And our view is that fair allocation of spectrum is absolutely critical and key to ensuring that the competition that we have injected into the UK marketplace, that has driven both coverage improvements for consumers and price benefits for consumers, continues. And the reason why that's important, I think, is illustrated very well on this slide here. So the pink bars are the amount of spectrum, the airwaves, that was made available under a competitive auction, the 3G auction, way back in 2000. And under that competitive environment, 3 has been allowed to roll out its network covering 97% of the population, to bring down the price of data from £50 to a gigabyte, and grow the number of consumers accessing mobile broadband on a daily basis, giving internet access to as many people in as many places as possible. What's happened in the last couple of weeks is that the government and Ofcom have decided to allow the incumbent operators, O2, Vodafone, and what's now called Everything Everywhere, the merger of Orange and T-Mobile, decided to allow those to use up all of their old spectrum, what we call the 2G spectrum, that was given away for free back in the 80s and 90s, and allow them to use that for providing access to mobile broadband and mobile internet services. What that's meant for us as a new entrant is that, because we're a new entrant, we don't have any of that old spectrum that was given away in the 80s and 90s. Now, if you believe that having less players with less spectrum is a good thing, I'd be very surprised, and I've shown the benefits that we brought in terms of coverage and price in terms of competition. We think this is a very bad thing, and we think the situation needs to change. The other important point here about the allocation of the spectrum is that O2 and Vodafone have got lots of the low frequency spectrum, which means they will be able to access rural areas very effectively and very economically. And Orange and T-Mobile have access to a lot of the high frequency spectrum, so they'll be able to provide better coverage and service in urban areas. But what that could mean for UK consumers is a monopoly, or potentially a duopoly, in rural or urban areas. And we think that's a very bad thing. Duopolies and monopolies generally aren't a good thing for competition. So, what's the role of government, what's the role of policymakers in all of this? I've shown you how mobile has now become, for many consumers, and it's a growing number of consumers, actually their default internet connection. It's replacing fixed for many people, and that trend will continue to grow. Mobile will replace fixed for a growing number of consumers within this Parliament's lifetime. So mobile needs to be central to government's internet strategy. It's not a complementary service for many people now. Policymakers, government needs to acknowledge that competition will provide expansion of coverage and also bring benefits of price to this marketplace. And spectrum allocation is absolutely fundamental to making sure that happens. So an effective spectrum auction will be absolutely key to ensuring coverage improvements continue for UK consumers and price benefits come through in the market. And we also need the government to provide not a blank sheet of paper to Ofcom, but clear policy guidance to Ofcom to design the auction to preserve a competitive environment. Thank you very much.
Thanks very very much. I'm Charles Arthur from Technology Editor of The Guardian. I must apologise for being late. I'm late because I was doing the things that newspapers often call for one to do, which is writing a story. One of the companies that's not here today, that did rather detain me. I'm terribly sorry about that. I think the way that I'd like to do this is to have everyone speak, and then we'll handle questions. So I'd just like to perhaps pose a question. Mark, you talked about the 2G, 3G spectrum there, and the unfairness, as you said, of the government giving that effectively to be used, the 2G spectrum as 3G. What would you have done? What would you want done with all that spectrum? Do you want it to be re-auctioned? Because surely that would cause a problem for all the operators who have it. What would be your solution?
Yeah, so I'm not going to go into all the technical details of how the auction would run for everybody, but there are many countries, for example, where that type of spectrum has been re-auctioned, and we think that's potentially an option. But the most important thing is not necessarily the mechanic of the auction, it's the outcome of the auction. So I want to focus on the outcome of the auction. The outcome needs to be preserving the competitive environment. We move to a place, this marketplace in the UK has already moved from 5 players to 4 players with the most recent merger. The opportunity and the threat, if we don't have an auction that allows a competitive environment, could mean the number of competitors reducing even further, and that is not a good thing for UK consumers. So rather than go into all the technical details of how we could do it, there are various mechanisms and means. The most important thing is the outcome, and that's what we need to focus on.
But you think it could be reallocated, and that there would be a way in which it wouldn't completely screw up everyone's mobile passwords?
Potentially an option. There are a whole number of other things which I'm not going to go into the technical details of how we might run an auction here.
Okay, there's plenty more on Spectrum if you're interested in Spectrum. Next call on Sarah Hunter, who is the head of UK public policy for Google.
Yeah, I'm not going to mention Spectrum.
And by the way, Mark, I'm afraid you lose 5 points for using the PowerPoint.
I'm not going to use the microphone either. Can everyone hear me? Is that okay? No? Do you want a
Standing.
Yes, I won't mention Spectrum, but I do agree with Mark's starting point really that mobile is, well, there's sort of a whole theme around mobile as the future. Mobile is now. I think, it was the future maybe 6 months ago, and we all know how fast the internet world works. The mobile is basically the most widespread technology in the world. And there's lots of statistics. I think the statistics in the UK are quite compelling, but I think the statistics overseas are even more compelling. About how the countries where actually access to the internet is almost wholly through mobile devices. Mobile search is bigger than desktop in Indonesia, in South Africa, and in Nigeria, for example. So I think it's kind of something that probably all of us in this panel would agree that this is extremely important. And one of the things that Eric Schmidt, our chief executive, always has at the moment is a kind of advice to anyone coming to him to say, how do we start a successful online company? His starting point is always, you've got to think mobile first. You've got to assume that your customers are accessing your services through a mobile phone, not a desktop. And why is it different? It's different because actually the mobile phone is a much more sophisticated piece of technology than your desktop. And his thing is, you think about it as having, eyes through the camera. Or ears through the microphone, or a voice actually. Your mobile phone can now talk back to you. So the things that you can do, the kind of services that you can run mobile online are much more interesting and much more personalised and potentially much more valuable both to a consumer and to a business. Some of the tools that you see being developed specifically for a mobile online platform go from the kind of sublime to the ridiculous, but all of them are much better than the desktop equivalent. So there's one which is Love Clean Streets app, which the Lewisham Council launched last year, where you're encouraged to take photos of the horrible streets that you live around and send them to Lewisham. I mean, it's the council who has launched this app. It's not just a kind of clean my street app where you hope the council listens. These guys actually have created this application to improve the service they provide. But there are much more sort of compelling services that organisations around the world have developed for mobile online, from Iraqi refugees in Syria get UN vouchers through their text messages for food. genuinely life-saving applications through a mobile phone. Or in Kenya, M-Pesa is the online payment banking system that actually is now the biggest bank in Kenya. There's 9.5 million accounts. So it is truly, you know, I know we're all probably a bit bored of the internet being transformative, but mobile internet truly is transformative through relatively simple applications. And so from a UK perspective, I do think this is something that the British government can take a lot more interest in, both as a service commissioner and as sort of the enablers of others who are trying to create services online. I think, you know, the question, is the UK government sort of, is the UK ahead of the curve or behind the curve? You know, this is not I'm sure there are other people in the room who have a much stronger opinion on this than I am. But I think there are some slightly concerning signs. For example, the Digital Economy Act, the sort of continuing uncertainty around Wi-Fi provision, free Wi-Fi provision, and whether Wi-Fi providers are, you know, going to be held liable for infringing copyright, and what that means for libraries, or, you know, the Mayor of London who wants to provide free Wi-Fi on the tube, for example. That suggests to me that there's not really an understanding of the power of mobile internet. And another thing, that only 40% of British businesses engage with the government online. So, you know, there is a whole opportunity, I think, for the government to maybe take the technology and the power of the technology a bit more seriously than they do at the moment. But as for spectrum auctions, I'll probably leave that to my colleague from Ofcom to deal with. Thank you.
It's interesting to hear Google, who doesn't want to tell us all the answers. That's sort of what Google's about. Is, you know,
Only the engineers.
You have to ask you specific questions, and then it's usually if you have a Guardian journalist and someone from the Culture, Media, Sport Committee and talking about mobiles, and then in the same room, there's only one topic. But we're here to prove that John Whittingdale that actually we can have other subjects. John is the chairman of the House of Commons Culture, Media and Sport Committee. John, please, do tell us what you think of the government and mobile.
Thank you. I have to say it's an enormous relief to be talking about something other than the subject I normally talk to
I
the Guardian about.
I did it this morning. I was sorted with that.
My presence here this evening is, if anything, a tribute to the prescience of policy exchange. When originally I was invited to come along, I thought, well, it's an interesting subject because there's nothing really to do with me, because I chair the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, which is in charge of content, but we don't really get involved in telecoms issues, which is, of course, is entirely the responsibility of the Biz Select Committee. But things change very rapidly. So my presence here this evening is a little more than simple disinterest. It was one of the reasons why it was, even before Vince's unfortunate remarks, of some interest to me, was because DCMS had already, since the election, sort of the next broadband policy. And you'll have seen that Jeremy Hunt has been leading on broadband policy and now has total responsibility. The government's broadband policy, obviously, I am fully in support of. And I agree with the government that we have, I think, reached the point where access to broadband is no longer a luxury. It is becoming an essential for the population. So much now is taking place online, and so many services are accessed online, so many opportunities are provided online, that I think there is a clear government policy and desirable objective to ensure that everybody has access to the internet. I represent a rural constituency, and even though it's not that far from London, I do have communities which are very remote and do not have access to all services. And where I slightly question the government's policy at the moment is the absolute necessity of universal provision of next generation access. Many of my communities don't have buses that go past the door. I think arguably they shouldn't necessarily expect to have next generation access, and whether or not the intention of the government to use licence fee payers' money to achieve that is a desirable object, I think is another issue, because one of the curious things about the government's broadband strategy is it does seem almost entirely fixated on wired access. And it doesn't speak a lot about the alternatives, and that obviously is where we come in tonight. Not just mobile, one of the alternatives is satellite. which I don't think also really gets mentioned in the government's broadband policy. But clearly, as Mark has described and Sarah confirmed, I mean, mobile access to the internet is growing tremendously fast and is likely to grow further. Innovations like the iPad are going to result in people wanting mobile access even more. With apologies to Claire over there, I was once lent by BT a wonderful device, which was the first generation mobile television using.
Had a bit of time.
It was an extraordinary sort of clunky device which used the DAB spectrum to provide mobile TV, and it didn't really take off, I think it is fair to say. But that is not to say that mobile television isn't going to take off, and obviously internet access is the likely way by which that's going to happen. Equally, I mean, another problem which we wrestle with is also related to DAB, which is the potential for analog switchover of radio in due course. And it may well be that one of the big obstacles to that, which is cars, and the fact that nobody particularly wants to have wires all over the place to fit a digital radio receiver in a car, might be overcome when we get to the point where internet radio is available in cars, and that obviously requires equally mobile internet access. So I think that this is something which is going to become more and more important, and therefore the debate tonight is a very important one. And now, since this sort of area has been transferred to DCMS and therefore within it to my select to monitor, I'm delighted to come along and listen to the experts tonight. Radio spectrum frequency allocation, it is a subject on which I have thought about in the past, but nothing like as deeply as Mark as others. So like Sarah, I shall keep well away, say that the government has adopted the usual strategy which governments adopt when they get a very difficult question, which is give it to Ofcom to decide. And therefore, probably the best thing I can do is to hand it to Steve, who will answer on behalf of Ofcom.
Let us indeed hand over to Steve, who is the hot potato. He's the group head for strategy, chief economist and technology at Ofcom, the regulator everyone loves to hate.
Yes.
Is it up to hate you, or I'm not sure? How's Ofcom? How does it feel inside? Do you feel loved, or do you feel?
I don't think you expect to feel loved as a regulator. It's not much obviously. We'll see. I wasn't going to talk at length about auctions, but can if anyone wants to. Until a couple of months ago, as Chief Technology Officer at Ofcom, recently took on a slightly wider brief. So we're going to have a very long discussion about spectrum, probably not very useful this evening. What I was going to do was start by setting out just a few numbers. Everyone can play these numbers games, but it's a bit of fun. So one interesting number, so the number of people accessing the internet on their mobiles in this country, I think was 5.7 million in 2008. 9 million in 2009, and had boomed to 18 million by Q3 2010. So it's massive growth just in the number of users. It's interesting to look at the way in which individual consumers use mobile phones. And there's been something of a shift. So if you break down the way particularly younger users use mobiles, assuming that's the way we'll all go eventually, they now spend slightly more time using their mobiles for internet access, about 25% of the time, compared to about 22% making voice calls. Reassuringly, they still spend most of their time texting, so actually the most efficient way of sending data over mobile networks is still dominant as far as they're concerned. Although the UK historically has been somewhat behind in terms of smartphone take-up, it's been catching up fast. So the rate of growth that started last year in smartphone take-up was 70% per annum. It's greater than anywhere else in the world. At the moment, I believe, at least according to our International Commerce Market Report published a month or so ago, we're ahead of, in terms of smartphone take-up, of everyone except Japan. Well, I'm sure we can debate the stats. What that all amounts to is a massive boom in data volumes, and we saw some of that from the network perspective earlier. The figure I've got here is an increase of something like 2,000% since the beginning of 2007. and obviously a problem for the sector is that hasn't been matched by growth in revenues. So I think over that same period, revenues of the sector declined slightly by 3.5% or so. The interesting thing looking forward is that, frankly, no one can predict what's going to happen next. The sort of, I suppose, the speculative nature of most predictions, I think, was illustrated very clearly just a few weeks ago by the fact that at the Consumer Electronics Show, most of the new devices that are being presented are new forms of tablet computer. There's a massive interest in tablet computing, and frankly, no one knows where it's going to go. But I think Cisco have been quite brave, and they've given us a forecast, which is one I usually use. They project that globally, mobile data traffic will double every year through to 2014, increasing almost 40-fold over that period. Now, of course, we can all come up with different estimates, but I think that estimate of 40-fold growth in a period of about 5 years just illustrates the magnitude of, I suppose, both the challenge and the opportunity. So in terms of the challenge, what I really wanted to cover very briefly were 3 types of challenges for the infrastructure in the UK. The first is really how you meet this capacity crunch by making available more spectrum. I think the second point is what other ways there are of meeting the capacity crunch, that capacity crunch other than making available more spectrum. And the third issue is how you can ensure coverage across as much of the country as possible. So in terms of spectrum, the main thing we now need to do is really move forward from 3G to 4G and make available both the low frequency and the high frequency spectrum you referred to that 20 minutes ago. That has been held up for quite a long period, essentially by the threat of litigation and by various attempts to, I suppose, find ways of navigating through that litigation.
Just remind us who the threat of litigation came from?
Pretty well everyone, actually.
I thought it was principally from the mobile phone operator.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Was 3 one of them?
Oh yes. Well, I think the problem has been that each of the mobile phone operators has their own preferred way forward, and there was an attempt to try and find a way to keep everybody happy. Didn't happen.
Steve. But so effectively, what this means is that the capacity crunch the mobile operators are facing is partly caused by them complaining about the fact that they didn't like the way forward because it would cause.
I don't agree by that way. I think the technology isn't quite ready yet anyway, but it's certainly true that threat of litigation on all sides has been a key factor in delaying the release of the spectrum. Okay, so what is happening that is positive is that the government has now directed us to release the spectrum that we're talking about. And there are 2 chunks of spectrum that are important. There's a chunk of low frequency spectrum, which is freed up by the switch off of analog TV. That spectrum is 800 megahertz for those people who are interested in technical details. And there's a chunk of high frequency spectrum, which is somewhat complementary to that, at 2.6 gigahertz. That provides essentially more capacity, but isn't so good at providing coverage. What we're now going to do, with a fair wind and assuming no further legal delays, is auction that spectrum probably early next year. And what we would then expect is that networks using that spectrum would be able to roll out from around 2014. So that is a big step forward. It's a big step forward now. It's important to realise that that release of spectrum by itself can't solve all the capacity problems. If you think about a 40-fold projected increase in demand, there simply isn't enough spectrum to meet that sort of demand at these sorts of low frequencies. So I think the other important point I'd like to make is that release of new spectrum can only be part of the answer. It's somewhat perversely, the wide range of new mobile devices and new mobile applications that's now available is putting a focus back on fixed networks, because fixed networks are like to have an increasing role in offloading some of the heaviest data traffic from those mobile networks, essentially doing the heavy lifting in some of the areas that the mobile networks can't. That's illustrated most obviously at the moment by the ability of many current devices to switch between Wi-Fi hotspots and mobile networks. But I think one of the really interesting technical questions over perhaps the next 5 to 10 years is how that type of integration, those types of hybrid solutions will evolve, how that hybrid use of offload via local wireless onto fixed network and use of a wide area mobile network, how will those coexist? And that raises a number of interesting questions for the market. The third set of issues in terms of the infrastructure is really around coverage, and this tends to be another quite emotive subject. We published some analysis last year, a fair bit of consumer research, but also looking at some of the options that might be available to improve mobile coverage. Broadly, although most people disagree when I say this, is that mobile coverage is good, in that 97% of households in the UK can get at least one 2G mobile service. We had about 7% before, much share, which is a lot of credit for, I think, driving competition to deliver that coverage. Whilst 87% can access at least one 3G service. One important point though is that while that aggregate figure looks quite good, there are some quite stark regional variations. So for example, 91% of households in England can get 3G, but that falls to 40% in Northern Ireland. And that sort of regional variation is, I think, a problem. We also all have particular bugbears, particular areas where coverage is poor. So for example, I commute into London from Cambridge on East Coast Main Line, and my particular bugbear is the fairly crap coverage at various points on that journey. Everyone has their own sort of stories on those sorts of lines. So clearly there's some way to go. As we auction off this spectrum, one of the things we'll be looking at is whether it's appropriate to attach coverage obligations particularly to that low frequency spectrum, which is well suited to coverage. That's something we'll be consulting on soon. But I think it is worth highlighting that coverage obligations are not necessarily the most effective solution. It is striking that competition thus far has been very effective in driving coverage. As we've already heard, coverage is now in excess of the coverage obligations of most operators, and that's because of the competition in the market. So I do agree that it's extremely important that the way we auction this spectrum protects the level of competition that's in the market, as far as that's possible, and that is also something we'll be consulting on. I think finally, slightly less technical, as I understood it, one of the core questions for this evening was really the extent to which mobile technology can be transformative, I suppose, as a social and political tool, as well as a commercial tool. And I think, to some extent, that question's been answered. We've heard examples of, I wasn't aware of the Lewisham street cleaning example. The obvious example for me over the weekend, the last few days, has been the extent to which, I suppose, breaking news of what's happening in Tunisia has been via essentially a mobile medium. And I think that illustrates for me the important role of mobile as a means of informing people, as potentially a way of mobilising opinion. I think at the moment commercial organisations are very much leading the way, just the wide range of applications to everything from, I suppose, supermarket shopping to, I don't know, almost anything you can think of. There's an interesting question for government as to what government's role is in enabling innovation in the delivery of public services over mobile devices. Something worth considering, but I suppose the point I close on is that it may well be that the role of government in many ways is to make available the types of data which it has access to, which enable applications to be developed. I think that's something worth further thought. That's it from me. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, that brings us to the end of the sort of straightforward presentations. What I want to do now is to throw the floor open to questions, but equally, I want us to focus on the fact of what we're here tonight to talk about, which is entitled Generation Mobile. Is the UK behind the curve? Now, I think that actually, if we think about it, the UK is ahead of the curve in terms of the adoption of mobile, because something like more than 100% of the population has a mobile phone, if you go by the number of mobile phones and the number of people in the population. In terms of smartphones, I think that we're behind only Italy in penetration of smartphones in Europe. And we're ahead of the US in terms of the penetration of smartphones. So in that sense, again, we're ahead of the curve. But where I suspect that we're behind the curve is in, as Mark mentioned and Steve mentioned, the next generation, what's called 4G, or I think LTE is the long-term evolution, which in the US, I was out at the Consumer Electronics Show just the other week, And LTE 4G is already being used and implemented by Verizon, which is one of the two big wireless suppliers there. So in that sense, the UK is behind the curve when it comes to mobile technology. Now, the question that we want to deal with here, which would be useful to try to figure out so that we all go away a bit more educated, is really the twofold. Does the government have a coherent strategy for the internet going mobile? Because the idea is that actually, if we have so many smartphones, and if we have people buying smartphones at 70% per year, then does the government have a coherent strategy for what happens there? And how can this trend be harnessed for the government's big society agenda? Because don't forget that it's actually a stated aim of the government that people will deal with the government through the internet. That's actually one of the sort of core ideas, and that's part of what all the getting the data out there that David Cameron's been pushing so hard is about, is getting the data there, getting the interaction so that it's on the internet. And if the internet is mobile, then the government needs to have a strategy for it. So I'd just like to ask those two questions very briefly, go around our panelists. Mark, do you think the government has a coherent strategy for the internet going mobile, and how do you think it fits into big society?
Yeah, I think it needs a coherent strategy for mobile.
So you think it doesn't have that?
It needs to put. I think it needs to put mobile, as I said in my 10-minute speech, central to its policy, but not treat it as complementary, something on the side. As I explained, for many consumers, and that is a fast-growing trend, it will become the default solution for them. So mobile needs to be central to government's policy. My view on what it's worth on whether we are behind the curve, ahead of the curve, at the moment, almost irrelevant in terms of look how well we've done so far. My big concern is what's coming up, so the capacity crunch that we've spoken about, and the requirement to get this country's spectrum allocated in the right way to ensure that both coverage and quality benefits that will bring for consumers, and the competition, the competitive environment will be absolutely key. Because if it doesn't, then we will see coverage start to slow down in terms of the improvements and degrade as more and more of us are using more and more data. If the coverage and the spectrum situation doesn't get resolved, we will see a degradation in the service that's going to get worse. And if there's less competition, surprise, surprise, the prices are going to go up, and that will slow adoption down. So I don't want to focus on how well we've done so far. I want to focus more on what we need to do to stay an innovative country of mobile. And we've got great penetration of smartphones, thousands and thousands of very innovative developers developing applications for all sorts of stuff that we've heard.
So, and on the big society, do you think that it's in there? Do you think that
it's absolutely pivotal. We're talking about an option and a solution for consumers, wherever they are, with whatever socio-economic background, to connect to the internet, which is one of the most liberating things there is out there. So, there are many places, as we know, that don't even have fixed coverage, where mobile is a solution for them. If we want big society to actually take off and live and breathe, then mobile has to be front and centre of that policy.
Right. So, if I put government coherent strategy, internet mobile into the Google search box, do I get lots of guesses, or do I get
Yeah, exactly. Let's do a live experiment. My guess is they don't have a coherent strategy, and I'm guessing that largely because, as John was saying, there's been a kind of obsession about fixed broadband speed versus coverage. Meanwhile, mobile has become the most, half of all new internet connections are now from mobile phones. This isn't new. This has happened for the last, couple of years now. So my guess is they don't have a coherent strategy. I don't know if we should be that worried about the fact they don't, because I think actually, as we all agree, basically we're quite soon going to stop saying mobile because it's going to start to refer to the internet. It doesn't almost shouldn't matter whether it's fixed or mobile.
Wouldn't there be a bit of a digital divide though between the people who can afford the smartphones and the £30 a month, £25 a month, and the people who are on pay?
Well, I think maybe you'd expect people to say this, but I think competition is a good thing in this respect. And actually, the more competition, the more people using services, the prices will come down. I very much support the price of the market. I think the challenge for getting as mobile becomes more sophisticated and becomes more ubiquitous. Actually, I've noticed there's not that much great local content. It's quite hard. Of course, there's content was delivered for desktop, right? And so actually your specific location was much less important when you were creating an online service. And now, I'm walking down the street, I'd like to be able to be told, hey, there's a hairdresser around the corner, you know, or somehow linking up my appointments calendar with the local service would be really helpful. Now, that sort of local tagging of content is not very developed. And, I mean, that's a challenge for a company like Google, but I think it's also a challenge for big society, where, let's not forget, it's meant to be non-state funded. So actually, big society, in my mind, is sort of, you know, as much about local businesses as it is about, you know, good stuff. And I think that will be a challenge for the kind of big society, mobile internet crossover. Is how do you make local services visible when you're searching online?
John, I'm sure that you feel the government has an entirely coherent strategy for mobile. Can you enunciate it?
I'd say I have an instinctive reaction against governments having strategies for industry, and I think probably the reason mobile's doing all right is because the government hasn't got a strategy for it. I mean, there are issues for the government. You know, we touched on some, obviously something like spectrum allocation clearly is a matter for government, and in general, I would, without wishing to get into the argument between providers, I would share the view that a competitive market is a good thing. And I think that the rapid development of mobile technology has come about in this country largely through a competitive market. And I think that will go on continuing. And you know, we've had even speculation that one day people may get free iPads as part of a service contract in the same way that you currently can get free handsets.
What about the digital divide problem?
Well,
I mean, personally, I live in a rural constituency as well.
The digital divide problem and your linkage to big society, I mean, I think is a serious issue. As I was saying earlier, I mean, I do think it is now the case that not having access is a significant problem for people in rural areas and deprived communities and isolated groups. And therefore, I think that's something which we do need to address. I don't think the answer is the government to pay for them to have smartphones. I think that...
I'm not sure I was suggesting that. What about anyone suggesting?
I think it is important that we have universal provision, and that is part of the government strategy. As I was saying, I'm not convinced necessarily it has to be ultra fast yet, but I think a general requirement for universal access is important, and mobile undoubtedly has a part to play in that.
Steve, I think you must be exempt from being asked whether you think the government has a coherent strategy on mobile, because it's a sort of career and dangerous question. What sort of easy, I suppose. What sort of questions can you answer? Because I mean, you know, where can Ofcom position itself? Are you allowed to prod Jeremy Hunter and say, well, we think actually this would be a useful place to
provide advice? Well, two things. One is, you know, most fundamentally, most people get benefits from mobile because, as various people said, you know, competition, well-functioning market, and part of that is getting spectrum out under the right circumstances. And I think there's quite high to a consensus amongst all of us that that's the primary means by which the UK gets benefits from mobile. But this isn't about, you know, the government or Ofcom having a grand plan. It's about having the market work effectively. So I think that's the most important point.
So it's really about, you see your role as really encouraging competition, and it's raw, isn't it?
That's the core, and that's what delivers high quality fixed and mobile broadband and many other services to most people most of the time. And that's generally been where there's been some of the greatest success stories in this country if you look back over the last 10 or 20 years. That said, there are of course areas where the market, you know, there's risks of market failure. And I think both government and ourselves have recognised aspects of market failure. Broadly, I think there are three concerns floating around at the moment. One is this question of universal access to basic broadband. And I think there's a fairly high degree of consensus that some form of access to broadband is, you know, necessary pretty universally for reasons of social inclusion and so on. And that's probably uncontentious. And we've done a fair bit of work with government on trying to think about how you would enable that, both under the last government and this government. What is much more difficult is what happens is my point I make is that definitely includes wireless as well as fixed. And in talking about wireless, I think you have to go beyond mobile. In thinking about that, fixed, you know, that delivery of basic broadband encompasses a very wide range of wireless solutions, some which are mobile, some which are satellite, and so on. And you need to look at that complete mix. Then there is the big issue as to how fast it needs to be, particularly on this universal basis. And I think that's much more contentious. There is this whole final third debate. Again, there is a clear government policy there. I think
this is the final third is how you cover the sort of the third of the country, which is a long way away from.
Exactly. So BT and Virgin, between them, are going to deliver super fast broadband to two-thirds of the country. And the question is, at what point do you intervene, or do you need to intervene to cover the remaining? That's the final third bit. And again, I think there is a clear government policy, and we'll have to see how that plays out. That is much more technically demanding, much more expensive. I also think wireless, in terms of this evening's discussion, has a relatively limited role there. I think the problem with wireless solutions is they can deliver for short periods very high bandwidths, but they're not a very efficient way generally of delivering sustained high bandwidths for streaming video and stuff. You may disagree, but I think as you go to these super fast broadband discussions, wireless is less relevant. But then you get to the whole question of mobility, and it comes back a bit to the social inclusion question. We know that PC penetration has sort of saturated around 65% or so. So it's quite clear that both to reach consumers that fixed doesn't reach, and also because of the unique, I suppose, characteristics of mobile, there is also some importance to having universal mobile coverage. The work we did last year, we had, I think, rural communities pointed to agricultural workers who were able to access lifeline services when they're out in the field. So it's a wide range of issues that push you towards some sort of mobile coverage obligation. It's still unclear, though, whether that's based on regulation or actually just having effective competition. And I think that also remains to be seen.
Okay. Questions? Any questions? If you can say where you're from as well.
It's Constantine Lonticus. Just sort of comment on the balance between competition and innovation, because I think you mentioned that although data usage is exploding, revenues are actually going down, and the mobile networks will be required to go into a heavy Capex program for the next generation. The structuring of the licenses to incentivize networks to be able to make that spending and still earn a return, whilst at the same time allowing competition for consumers, is a difficult balance. And I'd be interested to know how that's viewed.
Difficult question. It might be better having a first
stab. I come from I suppose a different perspective than the incumbent operators on this one. Data is very much front and centre of data growth is very much front and centre of our objectives, and you've seen recently with Three moving to all you can eat data, whilst the other networks are actually cutting back their data allowances. We've got very different strategies. Having said that, just to be clear on the point where revenues are decreasing, revenues are not decreasing from data. Revenues are decreasing from voice and text. So they're decreasing for a number of reasons, but essentially more competition is driving the prices down there. But the opportunity, and all of the other operator CEOs have spoken about the opportunity to monetize data, effectively charge for little chunks of data. That is a big opportunity for incumbent operators. We take a very different approach at Three. But I think data is where the market's going. So I showed what's happened on Skype on our network. We've gone from 33 million minutes a month to 111 million minutes a month. In 6 months' time, that will be 200 million minutes a month. Voice traffic is now starting to be carried over IP, not over a traditional mobile network. Consumers are now, particularly our younger consumers, and you spoke about text messages, but younger consumers are now using Facebook as their primary, some people their only means of communication. You spoke about where's the local innovations. Sorry, I mentioned Facebook again, but Facebook Places and Foursquare are now actually starting to bring local presence, i.e. your location, which can only be done through a mobile device, into your social network. So I can take a picture right now, post it to Facebook on Facebook Places, and Facebook Places would recognise where I am, and that would be posted straight to my friends without me having to do anything. And that's where the market's going. So as a mobile operator, in my view, not just on Three, but the mobile operator sector in general, we have to structure ourselves for the future, not try and cling on to the old revenues of the past, which, on voice and text, a large part of those are driven from an archaic regime
where you've got mobile termination rates, being exchanged amongst operators, hundreds of millions of pounds.
So basically,
mobile operators have got to structure themselves for the future, which is all about data. It's not about 2G communication, because that's what consumers are doing. It's not because I've got to be, that's what should be happening. It's because what consumers want to do.
So basically, you're saying that actually the money's in the data, and that's what you're going to.
I'm saying the consumer behaviours in the data. So as a business, what you've got to do is follow the consumer, and you've got to look at what they want to do, and then what they're going to do. Look at what's happened in the last 2 years. Look at what's happened in the last year. The growth's amazing. So fast forward that 2, 3, 4 years. What's that going to mean for a mobile operator and our business model? It's got to be structured around data. So all the bleating and the whinging that goes on about the revenue streams, it's about the old world, not the new world.
So,
Rudy Bogni, Financial Services, plural. 2 questions in one, basically. Last auctions, clearly there was an attempt to maximize the value of the game. If I recall correctly, there was an academic expert in game theory that was advising the government on that. Now we're in worse climate, and it would take a lot, I imagine, from any government to try to justify secondary objectives like maximizing competition or social engineering, as opposed to maximizing the value of the game. And I would be very interested if you had a view on whether that is realistic or not. The other side of the problem that I think was outlined was the capacity crunch. And is there any political thought being developed as what happened if we do hit a capacity crunch, perhaps at a time when other countries are not hitting it yet, and all this magic world of mobile broadband is coming to an end from the user perspective. We just don't get the communication, and the world as we know it doesn't work.
I'll just speak actually to the capacity crunch question, because one of the things that's happening, Mark mentioned the analog switch off for TV, but there's also the possibility of analog switch off for FM, and that opens all sorts of radio wave bands which can then be reused by mobile phones, and that actually gives you small areas where you can get very effective transmission as well. So there's a lot of space actually available in the analog wave bands, which is all being explored, and there's lots of work going on to explore that. Steve, maybe on the game theory.
Sure. I mean, we should be clear about the way we think about these auctions. We have particular duties around ensuring competition. We also have duties around ensuring essentially access to these services across the UK, so coverage. Ofcom doesn't have a duty to maximise the spectrum receipts from these auctions, and that's not the way we go into the auctions, and the government hasn't directed us to do that as part of the recent direction. So our focus will be on designing the auctions so as to maximise competition, and potentially thinking about the coverage question. It's of course the case that generally the idea of an auction is to, I suppose, reveal the most efficient owner of that spectrum according to willingness to pay. So that aim of, if you like, spectrum efficiency does also tend to result in spectrum receipts. But we do not have a duty per se to maximise spectrum receipts. And that's
so you're confident you can ignore the deficit to the special case?
It's not our responsibility to deal with the deficit. It's one of the few things we might be responsible for, all sorts of ills of the world, but not the deficit.
Shirley Dent from PhonePay Plus. We regulate premium rate services. And I'm interested in Charles's curves, the after curve and the behind curve, particularly in relation to regulation. I sympathise with Steve when he says regulators are not universally loved. We surely aren't. But we do have a pretty good relationship with the industry we regulate. And we're interested at the moment in the area of convergence on the mobile internet, where areas might not be quite clear-cut as to regulation. For example, if somebody downloads an app or etc. on a smartphone and uses it on a smartphone, but it's being paid for from a bank account, where are we with regulation on that? I mean, this is just a question of interest about where are we on the curve in relation to regulation on the mobile internet.
I think that's obviously a question for the chairman of the business.
I'm a sort of veteran of, I think, these two Broadcasting Acts, or Broadcasting Act and then the Communications Act. In each case, I think they were out of date before they even received all consent. And that's part of the problem. You are dealing with very rapidly changing technologies, and attempts by government to put in place regulation are almost always going to be outpaced by the technology, which is why generally I'm more sympathetic to a self-regulatory system than a statutory regulatory system, since that does have the flexibility and adaptability to take account of changing technology. And in the main, I've worked with PhonePay Plus in the past, and I think you are doing a reasonable job at keeping up to date, but clearly there are going to be challenges. And part of my job as chairman of the select committee will be to try and ensure that government does keep pace with those.
Hello, my name is John Algar. I work in the city as an equity analyst. So the Strategic Defence Review really propelled information security to the heart of the public debate. Now, the panel have touched on a number of infrastructural challenges on the build-out of mobile broadband. To what extent do you think security features as a challenge? And that said, how do regulators and carriers work together to ensure and safeguard consumers and businesses? I suppose broadening the debate more internationally, I'm interested in how British carriers who are expanding into emerging markets form their privacy policies. Are they largely driven and written in their home countries, or to what extent are they influenced by the regulators in the countries they're actually expanding into?
Who would you like to pick that? Sorry, you're not feeling security is a sort of issue.
Yeah, I understand it from a Google perspective. I would say that the people who are best placed to keep users' privacy and personal data secure are often the companies. So and I think we do a really good job. I would say that, wouldn't I? But largely because we are run by engineers whose very sort of lifeblood is figuring out how to keep our users' information secure. And if we drop the ball, we really feel the consequences. Whereas I'm not sure that governments who are not run by engineers, for whom often user data, they are much more interested in having sight of user data than you would like. I don't think they're necessarily the best placed people to set the rules and to set the standards about how to keep personal data secure. The question about where policies are made, every company is different, but we basically adhere to all the laws of the countries in which we operate. So we won't operate in some countries, for example, where we don't like for example, the laws about, when the government asks for user data, you hand it over laws. We don't like those, so we don't run services in those countries. But on, for example, in the UK, we adhere to all the British laws around, data protection and all the European laws in that respect.
Was the scope of your question particularly data security and data privacy? There's a fairly wide set of security issues around network security, resilience, data privacy, and so on.
You're worried about what happens if the network falls down, or are you worried about what happens if someone's hacking the network?
Yeah, I guess I'm more interested in personal data being compromised with a broadband network.
So I would comment that there are changes in the rating framework coming into force soon. So as of April, a new European framework will come into force, which sets common European standards for those various aspects of security, including data privacy. Some of those do have to be resolved on a transnational basis. So most obviously, if you're worried about, I suppose, resilience of interconnected networks, there's no point in just trying to fix that within the UK. You need to worry about global connectivity. There is a great deal of work going on at the moment between different parts of government to understand how that would work in practice. I would also say it's extremely difficult. This is not an area where there's a simple solution. I think it's also a particular problem for our sector because of the extent to which other sectors depend on us. So, for example, we're doing a fair bit of work at the moment on a related initiative, smart meter and smart grids, which is an example of another sector developing an infrastructure which will ultimately depend, though, on the security of the comms infrastructure which underpins it. And there are plenty of examples of that type of interdependence.
Mark?
Quick thought. My only quick thought is, things are moving so quickly. So, the question around premium rate payments. We're looking at a virtual goods sector, so not even real goods. It's going to be $1 billion plus this year. So, virtual slippers bought in a virtual game. And if you don't like the size and shape of those, where do you go to send those back? So, how that's my thought. So, how? So, I don't know. It's a complicated and fast-moving subject that we've all got to grapple with and what the answers to.
So.
Rahul Bansali, I'm a management consultant specialising in the comms industry, but my question is more related back to public policy. The political cycle that we live in at the moment is very short term. The 24-hour news cycle drives headlines on a constant basis, yet the narrative that we're seeing across government is one of cost reduction and efficiency and the need to embrace working practices from the private sector, but we're likely to see conflict coming from trade unions, especially as we enter coming towards the budget, angry about the austerity measurements. What thoughts are the government taking to think about ideas from the private sector about the use of technology to bring about efficiencies in the way that public services are delivered? So be that at the call centre, be that through apps on the phone, that will revolutionise public services, yet also managing the emotive issue about the fact that things need to be cut.
Sorry, I think that David Cameron's met Google a few times in that industry.
Yeah, I mean, well, yes. Not the previous government too. I won't talk to anyone. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? I think there is.
He sounds neat.
Yeah. Well, I think there is I think there are bits of government which are terribly excited about how technology is going to solve all loads of problems for them, and can we just invent some apps, please? So I think there is a challenge, really, which is partly about managing expectations, partly about educating policymakers. Policymakers, frankly, and myself included, we should not be inventing apps, frankly. The worst person to invent an online service would be a policymaker, and I am a policymaker, so I'm not dissing anyone else in this room, other than myself. So actually, I think it would be better and I think actually the sort of open data initiative is exactly the right way to stimulate these sorts of services that can benefit consumers and the public service, is by putting the data out there and letting developers do their magic, because that is the only way you're going to get real innovation. And what I really hope is that actually a bit of government sort of takes the ball by the horns, like Martha Lane Fox's, online says, right, we're going to procure differently. We're going to, do a Dragon's Den style procurement for youth services, or some way of getting online innovators to step up and show what they can do. Because I think they can do amazing things, but I think the government is at the moment, on the one hand, like terribly overexcited, on the other hand, terribly sort of risk averse. And I think someone in government needs to step up and go, right, we're going to try something different.
John, the sort of stories I hear from within government is that there's a lot of push from people like Francis Moore to try to get things like the data initiative, the open data initiative going, and there's a lot of sort of passive inertia going on, and slightly more active inertia, if you like, from a lot of civil servants who don't quite like that idea. And what's your perspective of this trying to pull in ideas from outside, from the private sector, to make up this gap between the money that's there and the money that would be needed otherwise?
I would agree with Sarah. I think that the idea of allowing developers to innovate and come up with solutions rather than government trying to find them themselves is a vastly preferable one. Government is obviously extremely keen to find ways of doing things more cheaply, particularly in the present climate, but the history of government IT procurement projects does not inspire confidence, particularly about its ability to result in savings. And I think we are somewhat scarred by that experience.
So,
Ben Smith from Tribal Group, I'm a mobile technology blogger. To pick up on your point about government IT, seeing government as a user of mobile services rather than as a regulator or as a promoter of the environment. With mobile technology moving so quickly, it tends to be smaller firms, entrepreneurs who have the most exciting and market-changing disruptive ideas. Yet government's only very adept at buying from large incumbent providers. How does government access those thought leaders without going through the sort of the heavy, slow procurement frameworks that we're all familiar with?
Well, funny enough, I was at a seminar this morning on exactly one of these subjects, and two ideas. One is they should just say, right, let's carve out one government service, below a certain level, so the risk of losing lots of money is limited, unlike the NHS IT project, and procure in a really sort of like innovative, non-time-consuming, sort of ensuring small developers can take part way. The other way, and I used to work in a small business trying to procure from government, so I am very aware of what a nightmare process it is. Actually, big companies who do get the big procurement contracts, I think should be mandated to have kind of like 25% of your project should be done by a small developer company of this level turnover, whatever. So you should make the lead agency, if you like, take responsibility for bringing in the innovative new SME to co-partner with them, because I think that's a much easier way to sort of manage both the risk on the government side, but also get the innovation that you want, rather than just crazy ideas that look fun.
Yes, and I think there's actually some plans, again, coming out of the Council's Lord's Office, which would look to do precisely that.
It would be amazing if they managed to do it in such a classy system.
So,
Mike Bowman, Alcatel-Lucent. I just want to make a couple of observations, one of which is concerning the auctions. You may not be aware, but we've had an awful lot of people visit Preseli in North Wales. We're currently with Arqiva. We've been running a very successful ALTE 800 trial, and at 20 kilometres from the site we've been getting 50 megabits a second, and we've been getting it mobile. Now, this is, I guess, a question for Mark. In Germany recently, at the closed spectrum auctions, 800 megahertz spectrum sold at 30 times what all the other spectrum sold at. So this may be good for the coalition government because they may be going to make a lot more money out of this spectrum auction than they're anticipating, but it offers a challenge for the operators because everyone, certainly if you base it on the German experience, is going to be looking for the 800 spectrum and not for the 2.6 or 2.1.
Just sorry, was in Preseli in Wales, it's using 800 megahertz?
Absolutely, 800. And for those of you who are interested, go and have a look at the Cambridge Wireless website because hopefully during the conference in June, the 27th, 28th, we will be filling in some Cambridge not spots with another 800 trial.
Do you think you could do my bit? Because it's quite
I can't remember. Well, I was going to say we'll take bids. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is that there's a huge amount of supplementary technology with metro cells, femto cells, and everything else that's ready to fill in and help the capacity crunch. And Vodafone, and I'm not particularly carrying a flag about that, but Vodafone, led by Jenny Mundy, their CTO, has been very active in this field and has been extremely successful, and there are more trials happening now. So not only can I have a Vodafone complete blank area at our farm at home, but with 3 femto cells from Vodafone, we've got superb 3G coverage, broadband, iPhone access and everything, iPad access and everything else. So suddenly I'm on the Vodafone, we're on the Vodafone network, but shortly, phone boxes and other interesting places, and I was one of the people who unfortunately won a Telepoint license, so I've got the scars to tell on that story, but guess what? Metro cells are just like the reinvention of Telepoint. It's like a Groundhog Day because you're filling shopping centres and all these very difficult to cover areas in with metro cells. They're very low cost, they can handle a huge amount of traffic, and I believe that this is an area we're being very creative. And one final point I make, there's no doubt about it that 5 years ago, all my friends in the industry, and for those who don't know, I was one of the original founding directors of Orange, we're all being recruited by the Americans, everybody in North Africa, because we knew what it was all, in North America, we were the guys who knew this stuff, and they were so far behind the 8 ball it wasn't true. I have to tell you, the position is completely reversed. Verizon, you've just been to CES, they're running LTE, very, very interesting, huge number of devices and pieces coming out for it. I'm pleased to say that, you know, we certainly secured a $4.5 billion contract in supplying that and another one in servicing it. And so I believe there is a technology solution, but it disappoints me that already in Germany they're deploying it. In the UK we're going to wait another 3 or 4 years. So once again, we're not only behind our North American, but we're also going to be behind in Europe too, and I think that's very sad.
And sorry, since you had the experience, why do you think we're behind Germany?
Well, in fairness to Ofcom, they have struggled. There has been an awful lot of battles, or shall we say threats and counter-threats and things that have slowed up the regulatory landscape, whereas in Germany they were much more brutal and just said, we're going to do this.
So it wasn't due to the government inaction, it was more down to...
Well, I hate to say it as someone who's a champion of the mobile industry, but I do believe in competition, you know, comes in several shapes and sizes, and of course as operators we were always competing with other operators and we never wanted one to get an edge. I'm actually quite sympathetic to the Three contention that the refarming of the spectrum at the moment is pretty damn unfair if you happen not to be. But of course if you're O2 or Vodafone, you're very pleased about that. So, I mean, I think there is an issue, and I think in the end you have to be a bit like the government is being in the NHS and say, sorry, this is what we're going to do, end of discussion. And you make a decision and people get on with it, and I think there's been far too much pandering to the positioning of several operators making legal threats and all the rest of it. Change the framework so they can't do it, because that's what the Germans run with, and the Germans are deploying rural broadband now. Right now, and putting it into service, T-Mobile being one of the first in the game. That's it.
Okay. Just for those who don't know, a femtocell is like it's like a little mobile phone mast that sits inside your house. So it's like the sort of wireless router you use for your Wi-Fi, but it actually does a phone signal mast within your house.
Needs broadband.
Sorry, it
needs fixed broadband.
Needs fixed broadband, of course.
Another problem.
No, not really. It doesn't only need fixed broadband. That's the interesting thing, because you can connect it by Wi-Fi, you can connect it by all sorts of other things. Unregulated.
But it's a very difficult sales job, because you have to say to someone, buy this thing and spend some money on it so that you can use your own broadband in order to save us the data. It's a very difficult sales.
But actually, the growth of Vodafone has been staggering. And the other interesting thing that Mark would like is a great anti-churn device, because once your family has got them, then your family just keeps growing and growing, your friends who visit, everybody else. Bear in mind, one femto you can register up to 30 different numbers to it. And in commercial businesses in the City of London, they've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 femtocells sat on floors of office blocks. So once again, people's creativity, they want coverage, they want service, they want speed, so the customers are finding their ways around the problem once the industry itself has come up with some smart solutions. And there are a lot more to come.
An anti-churn device, no good for milk partners. But Mark, what do you think? 800 megahertz, is that where you want to be in mobile broadband? Are you going to be spending your money for that?
So I think we try and distill points that Mike's made down there. So the first is there are undoubtedly future solutions coming that can provide extremely high quality, high speed internet access through mobile. And as good as what we're seeing fixed today, and as good as what we might be able to provide and fixed in the future. So mobile can be an excellent solution with the right technology and the right spectrum. I'm not obviously going to comment on how much we'd be prepared to pay at auction for spectrum.
Do you like the little?
Of course we'd like some spectrum, but I think the key point is that, again, the auction needs to take into account the bigger picture. So, you know, as you've said, it's, you know, Ofcom's focus will not be on the revenue that it will generate for the Treasury. That, you know, the focus on the auction needs to be about creating the right environment to
to ensure that a competitive marketplace remains in the UK and that consumers get the right coverage as mobile internet evolves over time and that price pressure continues with competitive pressure. That's the important thing. So it can't be about just generating the most amount of money in one single hit, because that may mean that could quite possibly mean that we end up with a duopoly situation, potentially.
So John, the suggestion is the government should just change it and make it impossible for the operators to threaten with litigation, so you just get on and do these downwards.
I mean, I suppose that's always an option. I hear what's been said earlier about the litigation being counterproductive and actually slowing it up. I would be quite reluctant to actually just remove the right to challenge it. I think that creates additional problems on its own. I mean, I can see the attraction in terms of speeding it up, but I mean, it is a typically Germanic solution, and I'm not sure that necessarily that means it's appropriate for this country.
But we're growing faster than us in the world, if you like.
I might have been actually. There is a discussion going on without getting into an enormous amount of debate about the legal framework. I think the issue that BIS has recently consulted on is not whether the right to appeal is removed, but the particular way in which our merits appeal process works does make it particularly difficult to reach decisions quickly. There's a question as to whether it would be possible to move to another type of system, which I think has been described as JR+, which would still protect the rights of people to challenge decisions, and certainly as Ofcom we wouldn't suggest that should be taken away. The question is getting the right balance between that right to challenge decisions, but also the ability to, I suppose, react to market developments on a decent timeline. I think there's a consultation that went into this in some detail as part of the implementation of this new framework. So.
I think something involving a conflict there. I think we've got time for perhaps one or two more questions. Sorry.
Greg Hardy from Blackberry. Just a quick question, actually, more so for Mike, actually. I'm very curious as to what happened in Germany to the cost per data based on an auction that went up to 30 billion, and if that don't want to head back towards those £50 a gigabyte today, if the carriers are going to have to pay that much money for a new spectrum, then what is going to be the impact on the consumer based on the cost of data? I don't know if you know, or if it's too early to say what happened in Germany, but if there's any other thoughts about what will happen.
Possibly too early to say.
Probably too early to say. I mean,
the market prevails. It's as simple as that.
Probably someone goes bust and they want to last question.
What countries do you think do have sort of comprehensive mobile strategy or would be ahead of the UK, if at all?
I mean, one example we look at is the US, where the advisors and indeed Obama himself has said that mobile is absolutely central to that country's economic resurgence and central to providing internet access to the country. It's a central, not complementary. So the US is an example where the president has put his neck on the line with a very bold and clear statement about the importance of mobile.
I've heard someone call out Japan as a really interesting country where there's a lot of innovation at the business level, but also high penetration of super fast, fixed as well as mobile. I think that'd be an interesting one to watch.
I don't know, but I can see a select committee visit coming on.
Could be something really
What's interesting is the quite a few examples of countries which are headless in some ways. The US is a good example in terms of releasing new spectrum. I'm not sure that's because of a very complex strategy, so it comes back a bit to try and make sure the market works well. And I think in the US that's been very much the focus. Although Obama puts a lot of emphasis on the importance of mobile, I think in implementing that it is largely about making the market work.
Terrific. Well, I'm not sure that we've exactly answered every single question that I have down here, but I think we have actually covered a great deal of ground, and I'd like to thank our panel, Mark, Sarah Hunter, John Windell, and Steve Owen very much. I'm Charles Arthur from The Guardian. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the organisers who've done a fantastic job. I apologise again at the beginning. I think there's still a little bit of wine awaiting anyone who wants to stay, but thank you all again for coming.